1. This is Dateline News and Conversation. Tonight, we will discuss the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, which was held last month. We will discuss the Russia-Africa Forum, also held last month in St. Petersburg, and the so-called peace conference hosted by Saudi Arabia. My guest tonight, he's returning. He's the professor from Southeastern Norway University, Glenn Diesen. Glenn, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me back.
It's always great to have you. I don't know that there's a better analyst who can talk about all things Russia than you, Glenn. So I'm always happy to have you. Let's start out tonight. I'd like to know a lot about the St. Petersburg Economic Forum. If you can, and you were there. So I'd like to know a little bit about the history. What has been the purpose? Who's been invited to this traditionally? I believe it's been Russians and international interested parties. And who was there this year and what actually took place? So take it away.
Well, the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum is, well, as it suggests, is a forum to attract foreign investors and establish economic cooperation with different international partners. So it's an interesting forum for academics to attend, I think, because it's a combination of politics with all the ambassadors and such present, but also with a lot of major industries. Now, when this forum was originally set up, I'm a bit uncertain about the year now, I would say 2003, maybe a bit before. So it's been going on for at least 20 years. It was intended to attract the West. So this was not just to attract the investments to Russia and economic cooperation, but also it had some political purpose in terms of integrating Russia closer with the West. And indeed, this is why St. Petersburg as a city was founded in 300 years ago by Peter the Great. It was supposed to be the window to Europe. It's positioned at just on the Baltic Sea. It's effectively how Russia broke away from hundreds of years of being without reliable water connectivity, and it kind of returned to Europe. That was the general idea about this whole thing. So that's kind of the spirit of the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, the Europeanizing Russia, Russia's return to Europe. And in the past, there has been, it was always attended by quite senior, both political and as well as economic representatives from the West. Now, obviously, not so much. I came across many Europeans there, as well as Americans for a sake, but not in the same degree as in the past. And that's why I think that the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum was quite different, because now it's being seen as a forum to diversify away from the West. So a lot of people from Asia, China, India, but also Arabic states and Africa, Latin America. So effectively the whole world except the West. So this is quite interesting. And this is, well, especially for me, because this is my research area, which is Russia's integration with what they call the Greater Eurasian Partnership. So the efforts to avoid this excessive dependence on the West and instead integrate closer with the rest of the world. And again, for me, this is the big paradox of this, or contradiction, if you will, or the new turn, at least, for the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. Again, just from first being a forum to integrate with the West, and now it's to decouple. Originally, it wasn't meant to decouple either. They wanted to diversify away from the West, at least from 2014, when the West toppled the government in Ukraine. This kind of signaled to the Russians that there would be no incremental integration of Russia into Europe. Instead, we're creating this hard border. We're converting Ukraine from a bridge to a bastion or a fortress against the Russians. So this kind of convinced them that, okay, they can't be so dependent on the West anymore. We have to diversify. And they started to go in this direction. And you saw more and more people from the rest of the world appearing at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. But from 2022, because of the sanctions, the decoupling from Russia now, it's gone from merely diversifying to decoupling from the West. So it's and you can imagine a huge country like Russia with all these natural resources, when it's cutting itself off from the West and linking up with the rest of the world, there's a lot of big agreements being done with huge political significance. So again, it's for an academic was great to attend.
Okay, so what it seems to me is what you just said, at least beginning in 2014, this has represented a really significant strategic, diplomatic, and economic shift in Russian thinking. And I want to ask you now specifically, with so many people from the other parts of the world, not so many from the West, what were some of the outcomes? Now, I had read where there were a lot of deals that were made economically. So I'd like you to speak to that first. And then, if you would, to any political shifts or outcomes.
So it was a big question. Well, it'll be hard to get into, but the specifics. But I guess, yes, simply put, it would be to continue this, this diversification. And it's important to note that it's not merely to change the specific trade articles or something to replace one import from the West to another one. It's I think the larger picture, which is worth following, is that they're seeking to effectively reorganize the entire international economic architecture, because what usually creates the economic dependencies, and again, if you're going to decouple, what creates economic dependencies? Well, it's things you can't really diversify away from. You have your strategic industries, which is the high-tech industries. So this is of course an important aspect to develop new technological partnerships and shift the entire supply chains, which now the vulnerability of excessive dependence on the West has been demonstrated. But we also see, I'm not sure what deals were made in that area, but changing the transportation corridors. For example, a big issue has been developing more reliable transportation corridors. So a key topic there, for example, which I participated on as well, was the Arctic, because traditionally the Arctic is Russia plus, now that Finland and Sweden, soon to be Sweden, joining NATO, it's effectively the only Arctic states is Russia and 8 NATO countries. So Russia can't cooperate with them anymore. So now Russia is inviting all these non-Arctic states into the Arctic, from China, India, Arabic states. And so this is quite an important aspect in order to develop new, more reliable transportation corridors, open up the Arctic to non-Arctic states. It's also a key issue being promoted at this forum as well, as this international north-south transportation corridor, which is this corridor from Russia to Iran to India, which is kind of important for Russia to connect to the global south. And this is a huge project. Actually, it's already to a limited extent already up and running. So it's offering cheaper and faster physical connectivity all the way from India to Russia, and not just faster and cheaper, but also safer, because it doesn't depend on transportation corridors which are under Western control, which means they can under some situation put blockades, but not even that dramatic, can simply be limiting access to ports through insurances and such along that route. So a lot of this is being done, which is quite important. And then, of course, you have the financial aspect, in which there's a huge push now, as most have probably picked up in the media now, of de-dollarizing, to finding ways of trading in their own currencies, and shifting away from Western-centric banks. And I think that you'll probably see more of this in the months, if not years to come, which is the efforts by BRICS especially to come up with arrangements to at least do more payments in their own currencies, but also many countries aspiring for even creating a common currency, if not a common currency, at least a basket of currency which they can use to trade again, all falling under the same umbrella of decoupling from the West, or at least diversifying for the rest of the world.
Well, you mentioned the Arctic, and the United States has been salivating about getting a piece of that because of all the oil that they believe is there. And it was also interesting that just last week there were several Russian and Chinese military vessels that cruised through the Aleutians in international waters, but off the coast of Alaska, which kind of made some people in Alaska and the military in the United States take offense at that. And anybody that's objective about this finds that very duplicitous and disingenuous by the United States to accuse Russia and China of provocations in international waters. But that was an interesting point that you made, several of them actually. I was going to ask you about this basket of currencies and the de-dollarization, because I think that's a big issue. It would seem to me that just about everybody there would have been aware that that is already happening. But let me ask you now, grain and being able to feed the rest of the world, was that a topic at all? And well, I'm just curious, because it's been a huge topic internationally and politically. So was there any discussion about Russian grain, Ukrainian grain, getting out to especially Africa, the global south?
Yeah, no, I think more or less all these topics were discussed, but of course this was before Russia pulled out of the grain deal. That forum was back in June. But again, it's worth for those sitting in the West, it's worth noting that yes, some of the media coverage that doesn't get focused, like us here in the West, we usually read about Russia blowing up Ukrainian grain, also putting this blockade so prevents Ukraine from exporting, much of which is true, which is problematic. But what's left out of the narrative is, of course, that Russia is a much larger exporter of artificial fertilizers, as well as Belarus is into this, but also export of agricultural products. And a lot of this is stuck in European harbors, is ports, because they can't move it because of the restrictions that the Europeans are placing on this. So it's a key topic and a key issue how to solve this. But so, for example, with because you can't just hope that the West will play nice. So, and this is again the problem usually you have of sanctions, that the rest of the world learns to live without you. So you see in China and Russia and India, for example, talking about how to set up their own, and again they have their own developing their own transportation corridors, but also developing their own shipping routes. So there's constructing ships together, developing their own insurance systems. Getting into common manufacturing, a lot of joint ventures. So there's a lot of efforts being done to overcome some of the challenges, but it's still things take time. But I guess the main issue is that a lot of this, there's a lot of things being done, and it sometimes becomes a bit overwhelming. Just to jump quickly back to what you said about the Arctic, one has to appreciate how dramatic this is, because for those who follow the Arctic, we know that the Arctic is largely considered to be this region of stability or peace. It has always been exempted, not always, but mostly been exempted from geopolitics, which means that even during the height of the Cold War, when tensions were high, we saw that cooperation in the Arctic still worked. It was the region where we could have were building trust and collaborate, and again, exempted from the conflict. But this was a time when there wasn't that many strategic interests in the Arctic. Now, there's two things which has happened, which has changed all of this. One is that the water has, the ice has receded, and with that, there's a lot of economic opportunities appearing. And as we remember from the days of Mike Pompeo in 2019, he was very clear: under no circumstance would America allow any of these benefits to end up in the hands of Russia. So these benefits are, of course, a huge amount of oil and gas within the Russian Arctic, which is pretty much half the Arctic, but also opens up a transportation corridor, which you can commute from Asia to Europe through the Arctic when the ice is gone. And again, the Russians have a lot of these icebreakers. They've developing the infrastructure to accommodate all of this. So it's a corridor which would save both a lot of time and money in shipping. And while the United States control almost all the main maritime transportation corridors around the world, the Arctic would be pretty much outside American control altogether, because most of it goes through Russian Arctic territory. So there's a lot of now reason why the Arctic is becoming a zone of conflict. But also, if we look at where the Arctic, connects with the rest, we can talk about the Alaska issue, because that's kind of a bit interesting for many reasons. But if you look where the Russian Arctic connects with the Western, we always had also a peaceful area there, because the Swedes and the Finns weren't part of NATO, and Norway. We were in with NATO in the beginning, but nonetheless, we were always known through the Cold War as being good NATO, and because we had the self-imposed restrictions, we didn't allow foreign powers, or the American, British, or any other NATO forces up in the high north. We attempted to keep that demilitarized. There was also limitations on. We didn't accept any foreign bases on our soil, and no nuclear weapons. These sort of things. What's happened now, of course, is was a couple of years ago. 2 years ago, they agreed on it, which was the United States opening 4 military bases in Norway. We're not supposed to call them military bases. We have a different name for it, like an Orwellian renaming thing, so we don't have to admit that this happened. But anyways, we opened 4 military bases, and the Americans getting, obviously their intentions is to have a greater footprint in the high north to confront the Russians. And at the same time now, Finland, of course, which was the success story of neutrality, has now become the largest frontline state against Russia. And with Sweden also joining, you effectively will see a much more militarized, and Scandinavia, which will then trigger a Russian reaction, and it will have much more conflicts in Scandinavia as well. So I think, for this reason, the Arctic is bound, I think, to be now a region of conflict in the future. So for this reason, what can Russia do? Simply with these 8 Arctic states, when the other ones are NATO states, is Russia gonna? So Russia plus 7 NATO Arctic states, it simply can't accept dependence on those. Even the Arctic Council, which is addressing issues such as environmental protection, we shut it down. We suspended it because we don't want to sit down with the Russians anymore, because this is what politics is now. Everyone's become 12-year-old girls in the schoolyard, so you don't sit down and talk to the opponents. So it's simply they need other partners, which is why now they invited these other countries as well. So this is obviously a huge issue, because I sat on the the Arctic panel. It was me, an American, and I was on two of the panel. It was me, an American, and everyone else were from India, China, and countries which are very far away from the Arctic. So it kind of demonstrates the direction where things are going, so yeah, it's going to be a Eurasian Arctic, I think, in a few years.
Yeah, and you see that American boot print everywhere. They believe in this zero-sum game, that if any other country benefits, especially Russia, then America loses, instead of a win-win approach to, if we could work together, everybody, meaning everybody benefits. But that's not part of America's strategic plan. I do want to stay one more for a couple of minutes now on the St. Petersburg Forum. Did the conflict in Ukraine have any presence? Was it talked about how it was impacting the worldwide economic system? I'm very curious about that.
Yeah, so the format for the forum is you have a couple of days with different stands where they attract the investments and such, about both in terms of corporations as well as the distinctive regions. Even these new regions which Russia annexed were also, for example, participants there. So the topic of Ukraine obviously comes up in many ways, but even at the end on the last day of the forum, you'll always have the president, at least every single year, President Putin, he comes and give a long speech, usually goes on for 2 hours, and then do questions for another hour or an hour and a half. So it goes on for a while, and this year the Ukrainian war wasn't really brushed under the carpet. They had a long discussion about why this indeed was the reason why the world had to decouple, or at least reduce dependence on the West. They even played a video of Ukrainian war crimes by Ukrainian fascists during the Second World War. So it became a huge topic. I was a bit surprised, to be honest, that it took that much space. But it's worth noting why, because if we sit here in the West, we often think this is something Russia should hide and bow its head in shame. But what we've seen often the rest of the world is this war kind of exposed that a lot of the Western economies were unreliable, and also, so some would say, weak, because the assumption that you could break Russia, the Russian economy, the Russian finance system so easily, it proved to be wrong. And this not emboldens, perhaps the wrong word, but it kind of demonstrated that the world is ready to loosen its dependence on the West. That it's not the world isn't as Western centric as it used to be, and so I think many saw the Ukraine war through this light, that if it happens to Russia, it can happen to anyone. And again, we took all the money. It was supposed to be frozen from the Russian central bank, but now we're talking how we can steal it, and all this efforts of cutting off Russian energy, cutting off all trade with Russia, and of course the Americans blowing up most likely the Americans blowing up the Nord Stream. The Americans seem to suggest it's the Ukrainians, but I'm skeptical. I I think they're throwing the Ukrainians under the bus on this one. So again, the United States attacking the European energy infrastructure. It's a very dramatic things which are happening. And again, they attacked the German gas pipelines. The Germans don't say anything. Their politicians don't say anything. Their journalists don't want to talk about it. But for the rest of the world, this is quite significant. It shows that your transportation corridors, your pipelines, your supply chains, your banks, your money, your reserves, none of this is necessarily safe. And if there's one thing you should be worried about is a declining hegemon, because many have developed a good trust in the United States. But this is, I think this is something you see in a confident hegemon, when you have all this concentration of economic power in a hegemon as the United States was before. It has an interest in creating trust. It wants to show that it's a trustworthy administrator of the international economy. So everyone will integrate under their administered economic system, use their banks, the currency, rely on their technologies, simply because this allows hegemony to endure. And you don't want other countries to have reasons for decoupling. However, once you have a hegemony in decline, which we see now, I think the hegemon will begin to weaponize all dependence. If you use its industries, if you're dependent on its technologies, its transportation corridors, its currency, its payment systems, banks, anything, then all of this can be used against you as a weapon. And I think that's why it was important, I think, for the Russians to bring up the war in Ukraine as well, because it kind of demonstrated that, don't be afraid, you can decouple from the West too. There's a new world out there, and it's multipolar in most aspects.
Well, thank you for that. I think there are not many people in the West and in the United States that are even aware of the fact that this St. Petersburg International Economic Forum takes place, much less what was even talked about. So I think it's very important.
Can I interrupt you very quickly? Sorry. I was just want to say the reason why is because people aren't allowed to go there from the West. Of course, you have some government. I met some people from the German trade delegation. I spoke along with them a bit with them, but this kind of things. But everyone keeps a low profile because, for example, when I came back after attending, there was a bit of a media storm in the newspapers that, oh my God, a professor in Russian politics went to Russia during a very important economic forum. And so there's this new policing, what you're allowed to say, who you're allowed to talk to, where you're allowed to travel. So there's this huge now, push, not just censorship, but indeed cancellation. And so it's very hard for academics to actually do their job. Because if you go there, they say, oh, you're legitimizing Russia by attending, which is, I hope so. Like, why would you try to delegitimize? Like, you have to sit down and talk to and understand the other side. It's a very strange, I would say childlike approach here in the West now. And it's, again, I think it goes back to hegemony. I think for so many years, we're so dominant in the West that for us, diplomacy and cooperation meant that we would sit down. We would, if countries fell in line, then we would invite them to our meetings. We took the purpose of diplomacy was to socialize the inferiors. So we conceptualized very openly all cooperation as being between subject and object, or between the teacher and the student. So we would try to socialize Russia to become like us. And if they behaved well, we would reward them. They would be invited to come here for our meetings or something. And if they did not behave well, this is what we call policies we don't like, not behaving well, like a naughty child, then we would punish them. And again, this is the mentality we have here. So, Russia has done something we don't like. It's now we have to punish them. So we won't talk to them. This is this is the opposite of diplomacy. The more conflict, the more you need to talk, the more you need to understand. And now we see them decoupling from the West in such a huge way. Like Macron pointed out, the Western hegemon is coming to an end. and it has come to an end. And we don't even want to see what's happening on the other side. And you have academics who go there to try to understand how the world is transforming in front of us, and you're just crucified because you travel to the wrong place. It's just, yeah, I think that's why people don't hear it, because we think that if we pretend it doesn't happen, if a journalist won't write about it, then we'll shame Putin. It's like, oh, it doesn't get any attention. The problem is the entire rest of the world was there, and we end up isolating ourselves. And I think that's what people don't understand. If the world is no longer Western centric and the whole world participates except you, then you're isolating yourself. And I think this is what's happening. Sorry for interrupting you.
No, thank you. And very well said. The United States is isolating itself. And I think you articulated very well about the people who were there and the discussions that were had and the deals that were made have made it very clear. And I like the way you use the word decoupling from the West, but it's decoupling from the United States and the dollar, the power of the hegemon. I want to move on to the next topic because it is so much related to the hegemon declining in influence and power. The Russia-Africa Forum that was held recently in St. Petersburg. Tell me about that, how significant it was, and what were some of the results?
Well, it's quite significant, simply that it happened to such an extent. Keep in mind that when Russia invaded Ukraine, a key objective, of course, was to isolate Russia in the world, which was silly for two reasons. One, it's very difficult to isolate a country like Russia with all its resources. It's such a huge country. But second, it also was marred in this delusion that we're still living in the 90s, that if Washington snaps its fingers, the whole world will follow. But instead, we saw this other shift instead, which is that the whole world, effectively more than 85% of the world population living in countries which doesn't want to join these sanctions. And of course, Russia has focused a lot of its energy into developing its relations with Africa. Again, a massive continent, and if you want to diversify away from the West, it's quite silly to ignore Africa. And also, Russia has quite good history with Africa from the Cold War, as it was a big proponent or pushing hard for decolonization. So as China is increasing its footprint in Africa, Russia is trying to do the same. Obviously, it's a smaller player, at least economic-wise, than the Chinese. But nonetheless, it has a lot of good partnerships in the region, and it was quite interesting that so many of them became a success to this extent. Because again, the main objective, if you open any Western newspaper, is always, how can we humiliate Putin? We have to make him look weak. I think it's all part of this dream of regime change. Anyways, this across Africa, there's reports on a lot of pressure from the West that don't attend this meeting by Putin, blah blah blah, and but nonetheless, the whole continent, almost the whole continent, I think except Kenya, lost. Anyways, it was considered at least a success that so many countries showed up, and the Russians also used this. They used the moment to, used the event to cancel a lot of debt to Africa, offering to supply a lot of free grain free of charge, and so it was an important meeting, and I think even in the West, I think it became a bit of a wake up call that we've been living in a bit of a, with some delusion, assuming that Africa would simply do as they're told, and even have the African countries saying we don't appreciate this pressure from the West, we don't like the bullying, and we want these economic opportunities with Russia, and we appreciate the friendship and the role they had during the decolonization era. So it was it's also a big event, something ideally our media would attempt to inform the public instead of shaping the narrative. I think we would have read more about it as well in this media.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong. The United States, France, the Netherlands, Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, they've been colonizers. Many of them have colonized much of Africa. France right now is really taking a hit. They went in not to help these countries develop. They went in to rape and pillage these countries and take their resources, everything from, gold, diamonds. I don't know what else they might have had. I'm not that familiar with all their resources, but it was colonization. It doesn't seem to me, Glenn, and correct me if I'm wrong, that Russia and China now, who are making inroads into Africa, are not attempting to colonize and to rape and pillage. Russia is sending grain for free. Russia releasing these people from massive debts. China doing the same thing and building infrastructure. Do you think that Russia and China have a goal of being imperialist, colonialist? Or do you think that it really is a different game, not a zero-sum game, but a win-win game? I'd like your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and I think before you also said that there's a tendency in the US to see everything in a zero-sum game. And I would add that there's also a misperception, especially if we look at China, that the threat is that the US dominance or US hegemony will be replaced by Chinese hegemony. But the idea that China would dominate to such an extent it could claim exclusive spheres, for example, in Africa, and dominate in this way, it doesn't have the intention or the capacity to do so. You can see this because, well, first of all, the capacity. If China would attempt to do such a role, even Russia would seek to balance the Chinese, because the Russians have made it clear they don't mind China being the leading economy, but they can't accept Chinese dominance, then being defined as the Chinese being able to dictate to the rest of the world. And again, the difference between leadership or dominance would be the ability of the different countries to diversify, and this is the problem. And because and that's what you see in Africa, because unlike often the West, when it says you're either with us or against us, you have to choose us or them. You don't actually hear this rhetoric from China or Russia that you have to choose us or the Americans. You can't have both. So far, at least, I'm not sure if that will be always, but so far the argument has been, that they shouldn't be dictated to, that they should be able to trade and deal with both sides. And this is indeed what the Africans and other states want as well, because it's not like Africa was decolonized and then they're completely autonomous. Especially the French, they still have a way of plundering, and this is why countries need to avoid having so much, I would say, excessive or too much dependence on one state, because then they get trapped in this asymmetrical interdependence where they are very dependent, for example, on France, while the French are not so much dependent on them, and then they can dictate the terms of the economic relations and extract a lot of political influence. So this is not something that's ideal. So often what you see now is China and Russia coming in. They're not claiming exclusive spheres of influence, and I think that's also why there shouldn't be that much worry about this idea that the US hegemon will be replaced by Chinese hegemon. I think the US hegemon has been replaced already, and the name of the game is multipolarity. And this is what all countries want. You see it in Saudi Arabia, Turkey, all these countries. They don't want to switch from being a protector of America to be a protector of China. They want to have greater autonomy and political independence. And what do you need for this? Well, you need to diversify your partnerships to avoid that one dominant state can't take advantage of you. And that's what the Chinese so far has delivered, and that's why they're kind of happy about this as well. I mean, I might be mistaken, but did you watch for example, the Russia-Africa summit and see at any point the Russian delegates or Putin demand that Africa cut ties with the Europeans or impose sanctions on America? No, this isn't happening. And I think that this is why it's also politically quite preferable for the Africans to deal with the Russians and Chinese, because they're not attempting to dictate to the Africans how they should live, the government they should have, and who they're allowed to trade with.
Yeah, I agree. And you keep mentioning multipolarity. Well, it's been Russia, President Putin, and China who have been providing the understanding of what multipolarity means. And I'm not mistaken, but Putin, more than Xi, has really stressed the sanctity of the sovereignty, the independence, and the respect of all countries, large and small, the strict observance of international law, and the principles of the UN Charter. It's pretty clear that Russia and China really do believe in this multipolar world without a hegemon. I think they've made it clear. The other thing that I interviewed a friend of mine, Jeff J. Brown, who I think is probably one of the most informed Americans, Westerners, about China. He's lived there for more than 16 years. He's written several books. And when I asked him this question about China, does China have imperialistic goals and a vision? He said, that's ridiculous. If you look at the history of China for thousands of years, they have been trading all over the world, and never did they impose or dominate these other countries. He said they were interested in trade and culture. And I think he was right. And so I think if we look at history, especially the history of China, they don't have any intentions of becoming a hegemon, of becoming an imperialistic country. I think China, and I don't know what to call them, they're communists, they're capitalists, whatever, they're just interested in development, in culture. Anyway, that's just my thoughts on it. And
yeah.
Really,
you can also you mentioned culture, and one initiative by the Chinese which is worth pointing out. It's not only that they say they want multipolarity, you also see this in their economic policies as well, that they let's say Russia doesn't want to be too dependent on China. It creates this partnership with Iran and India. China doesn't oppose it because it doesn't. If, for example, in the United States, yes, they push unipolarity, dominance. That means you have to disconnect the Russians from the Turks, divide the Russians from the Chinese, divide the Chinese from Iran, India from Russia. So you have to create all this division. You don't actually see that from China. So their economic policies alone should suggest that they're quite happy about with multipolarity, but also this initiative they have, which I want to mention, is I think it's called Global Civilization Initiative, something along those lines. Anyways, it's quite significant because when, for example, in contrast to the United States, it promotes a lot of universalism, which says, you have all these universal values, which means, they apply to all people. And we will, much like after French Revolution, the Americans will come and defend other peoples, which, there's a protest in China, that's America's business. This is universal principles allows you to, remove national borders to some extent. And this is also, the Chinese Global Civilization Initiative effectively goes on saying that, you don't have you shouldn't claim civilizational superiority. It says all civilizations are distinct. So they all have a unique value. They follow their own path of development, and It's not for one civilization to assert its dominance or lecture another one. Now, this is quite important because this, well, if not an ideology, at least it's ideas that's usually associated with conservatism, which is that they shouldn't try to make a big blob out of everything. If you want to assert your dominance over other countries, pursue hegemony, then you embrace universalism. Say, we're all shared by the same goals, values, and therefore you eliminate the need for distinctiveness. When you call for civilizational distinctiveness, you're saying every civilization should preserve its distinctiveness. They have their own individual path to development. In other words, it's not for China to dictate to the Saudis how they should develop, or dictate to Kenya what policies they should have. This is, they're different civilization. They should have a different path. This is a way of expressing sovereign equality, that we're all the same. And you mentioned international law. They also want equal. They're championing international law. And again, this is also based on the principle of sovereign equality. And again, you can contrast it with what the United States is doing. It's not calling for international law. It's calling for the international rules-based system, which you and I have talked about before, which effectively is based on a lot of universalism, which is, democracy, human rights are universal principles, which sounds lovely, but what it really translates into is, because America is the champion of this, they claim to be a champion of this, then they can interfere in your domestic affairs. They can topple your government. They can sever borders. They can invade. And all of this falls under, democracy promotion or humanitarian intervention, or it's some liberal principle, but it's the right of the United States. So the US doesn't have to follow international law, but its adversaries must. This is the international rules-based order, and essentially making liberal democratic values as a way of exempting the US from international law. So, and this all fall under universalism, and this is often also derided in the West as globalism. And China has effectively rejected it. It says international law, distinctive civilizations, and pursuing this multipolar economic policies. So I agree with your friend that I don't think things may change in the future, but for the past 1,000 years and currently, the Chinese are not seeking to replace and recolonize Africa, if you will.
Yeah, and to me, this is all very exciting and hopeful when there's not a lot of reason for hope and excitement when you look at what else is happening in the world. But I have this question for you. And this may not be in your strike zone, but do you think China is learning a lesson from what is happening in Ukraine? They're having the same thing brewing now in the East China Sea, the Taiwan Straits, and in Taiwan. They seem to be being very patient now with what America is doing, pumping millions of dollars more, committed more weapons for Taiwan. Do you think China has learned a lesson from what's going on in Ukraine?
It's a good question. Well, it depends what the lesson would be. Again, the Americans are quite interested to make sure that Russia is defeated in Ukraine, simply because they want to send a message to China not to get too emboldened. But I think that perhaps one of the lessons from China for looking at this is that they might see that Russia walked into a trap to a large extent, because again, this didn't happen out of nowhere. I think that because when Russia invaded in February of last year, it's worth remembering that after the first 3 days, they attempted to start negotiating with Ukraine. They didn't attempt, they began to negotiate with Ukraine. And then again, we're not going to go through it now, but just a ton of evidence that the Americans did everything they could to undermine and directly sabotage these negotiations in order to put the Russians in a place where the US, by their own admission, could weaken and bleed the Russians. fighting with a proxy, as many American military and political leaders often state, that this is a way of, you get to fight Russia without losing Americans. Now, I think that the Chinese will be quite wary if a similar position could be recreated in Asia, in which America can weaken the Chinese economy, kill Chinese, and try to isolate it in the world without putting itself in the firing line. So fighting through proxies. So I don't know. I think China is. I think it's different from what's happening in Ukraine. First of all, Taiwan's not a country, while Ukraine is. But also, I think that for even CIA, former CIA analysts recognized that part of the reason or challenge for Russia was that in late 2021, they saw that America was entrenching itself more and more in Ukraine. Time was not on Russia's side. More and more weapons came in. America's presence was more and more powerful. They feared that the missiles which they placed in Romania and Poland could also appear in Ukraine. There was, especially in 2021, there was a huge escalation in terms of cooperation and military exercises with the Ukrainians. So a lot of this, I think, was a former chief analyst at the CIA, Beeb, or something along those lines. He said that the risks for Russia, he said in December 2021, the risk for Russia of not invading are becoming greater than the risks of invading. So this was the key problem. So time was not on Russia's side. I think what's quite different for the Chinese is time is on their side. Every year that passes, the Chinese economy grows, the Chinese army grows, and the relative decline of the United States continues. The US will have a huge amount of problems in the 1 or 2 years to come in terms of its money, its currency, its banks, its society. They have so much problems. So I think that the Chinese see time as being on their side. They won't be pressured into anything because, again, they don't want to go to war with Taiwan. They consider Taiwan to be part of China. If they bomb Taiwan and also China gets hurt, this is not in their interest. I think they have a real prospect of having gradual integration of Taiwan, and even if a conflict would occur in the future, it's the longer they wait, the better China's position would be. Again, in Ukraine, the situation was completely different. The Ukrainians were de-Russifying the country quickly. They were suppressing the language. They were canceling out all the opposition parties, arrested opposition leaders. All the Russian media was being removed, Russian-friendly media. The Russian language, Russian culture, Orthodox Church, everything was under siege, as at the same time as the Americans were pumping the weapons, the country full of weapons, training its army, and also aligning it closer with NATO. So I think those are the two main differences, which is why I think China wouldn't initiate war there in the same way that Russia invaded. But again, I might be wrong, because China's patience is not unlimited either. And I think that if the US continues to push this, they will also kind of at some point reach the same conclusion, which the Russians are again learning now, which is the failure to retaliate might simply embolden America to push even harder. So this isn't just America, by the way. This is all states. There's always a dilemma. Do you escalate or do you stand down but then embolden your adversaries? So this is, I think, but no, I don't think that they would follow the Russian path on this one.
Well, I appreciate that distinction, and I sure hope you're right that China has had a lot of patience. It's a very ancient culture, and unlike the United States, they don't think about today or tomorrow. They're thinking in terms of hundreds of years, thousands of years. And I agree with you, and I hope we're right, that I think China sees that the United States is weakening economically, militarily, and politically, and culturally. They know what's going on in America. There's no secret to what's happening in America. When we say the hegemon is in decline, the whole country of the United States and its vassals in Europe are in decline. So I agree with you. With
But
a
it's
little
also what
time,
you want to achieve from a war, because even if they go to war and the Chinese defeat the Americans, this is the age of nuclear weapons, and this is what I find so frustrating here in the West. When it's like, oh, if we just give a bit more weapon, we can defeat the Russians. What do you think is going to happen? You think NATO's going to march through Crimea as all the collaborators are, dealt with? No, it's never going to happen. Nuclear bombs will rain over Europe long before we march through Crimea. So you can't defeat a nuclear power. So I don't think the Chinese the same thought. Like, what's the thing? They're going to defeat the American army. America would not. It wouldn't go down without a fight. They would also resort to nuclear weapons. So this is it's a horrible idea. You don't want to win this either. You don't want to be defeated, and you don't want to win it either. So just avoid it altogether. So I think hopefully there's a lot of common sense in Beijing.
yeah. I just did a show with Scott Ritter last night, and it wasn't about analyzing the conflict in Ukraine. It was all of his experience with nuclear treaties and disarmament. And his message was the United States, Russia, China cannot afford to go to direct head to head war because without any arms controls right now, quote unquote, he said, we're all dead. And I think that's how dangerous the situation that we're approaching an all out war, direct war between these nuclear powered countries. Yeah, it's really frightening to think about. All right, we have a little bit of time left, and I'm not in a hurry, but uh, the other, I think, really significant happening event was the Saudi peace conference. Um, I think it was a bust. I think it was a PR stunt. Um, but I'd like to know what your thoughts are on that conference without the participation of a major player, Russia.
Yeah, no, this is they call it a peace summit. We actually recently had a similar peace summit in Copenhagen, and it's the same format. You try to discuss. You say you want peace, but you don't actually invite the other side. They didn't invite the Russians. They didn't even discuss Russian security concerns about NATO expansion. And again, as even the Ukrainians pointed out, their objective wasn't even peace. They said the objective, and this is from the spokesperson of Ukraine, was to rally the world around Ukraine and to isolate Russia. And this is that's the support for its peace plan. Well, its peace plan is for Russia to capitulate, withdraw from all Ukrainian territory, pay reparations, and Putin has to step down. I mean, it's ridiculous. This is not I'm not sure if more has to be said why it's quite silly, but anyways, I don't think it was meant to achieve much anyways. And again, they had some difficulty or failure to reach to sign a common document simply because there's not much to agree on. This is it had a very explicit purpose also for the West, because it was the West that asked Saudi Arabia to do this, and Saudi Arabia, of course, is happy to play a diplomatic mediator. He wants greater global reach, and of course, it's good to have if it was organized by a NATO country, more countries would ignore it. But I think the Chinese, especially if they're invited by the Saudis, they will send someone, and then the West can say, "Haha, look, Russia's isolated." And that was obviously the intention from Washington, is to sow divisions between the BRICS countries, and again seek to restore control over the narrative that somehow Russia is isolated and losing. So again, I find the whole thing at this point personally frustrating as well, because again, we have a huge war here in Europe. This is can go into nuclear war any day. It's hundreds of young men die every single day. We really, really need some kind of start to negotiate. People always say, "Oh, you have to give." Oh, Ukraine doesn't want to give away territory. Yeah, all this, but the fact that we haven't even sat down with Russia, talk to them, find out what we can do in terms of European security to prevent something like this from happening again? Nothing. 18 months, nothing. Just send weapons. And our NATO Secretary General now, he's pretty much just paraphrasing George Orwell. Weapons are the way to peace. I mean, it's become so insane. And now, of course, in the tradition of Orwell as well, you have this double speak where now peace summits for purpose of defeating Russia. I mean, it's ridiculous, but at least the media has something to write, I guess.
Well, thank you, Glenn, for this very interesting and informative session. Appreciate it very much. I know you're a very busy guy. You're in great demand. So I appreciate every minute that you can afford me on this show.
Anytime.
Yeah. All right. Take care. Enjoy. Be well.
You too. Stay safe over there.